Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. Unfortunately, the United States tends to support campaigns of political repression and state terror in Central and South America. Assassinations, coups, and political meddling are our game plan if it would result in installing a friendly, pro-neoliberal government with whom we could do business. But in the past few years, a wave of progressive politicians have been elected across Latin America. Described as the pink tide, there appears to be a hard turn to the left. What's going on? Let's discuss with Dan Kovalik. Well, warm greetings. And now we have a friend of the show. This is your second time, Dan, so that makes you officially a friend of the show, coming from left field. And I'm so looking forward to chatting with you about your travels and your writings and so forth in Central America, Latin America. And I'll let me give you a little introduction. You were a graduate of Columbia Law School and spent a good portion of your time as the general legal counselor for United Steelworkers, AFL-CIO. So you got your chops representing the union, and you are a prolific writer. You write a book a year. I don't know. Do you have like a college buddy with Adderall that keeps keeping you up at night or something? Your books always have a good plot, but let me just go through some of the ones. Plot to scapegoat Russia, plot to attack Iran. I've read this one, the plot to control the world, which is U.S. spending billions to influence elections and mingle or interfere around the world. This one was very good. Just finished this one last week, the plot to overthrow Venezuela, and I really want to chat with you about Venezuela and some of your work with that. No More Wars, again, about how we kind of meddle, if you will, in international affairs. And we had you on with this book, plot to cancel this book. How'd that book go?
Good. It did pretty well. All did pretty well. None of them are bestsellers, of course, but they all, did modestly well. I'm very happy with it.
Good.
So,
and we don't have this book. I made a cover just to show people. This book is going to be coming out in probably January. You finished this book. Is it you all done with it? Nicaragua?
Yeah, pretty much done and just waiting to be printed and published. Again, it is scheduled for January 2023, and I think it'll be out by then.
Good.
So,
well, you are an absolute expert on Central and Latin America. I think that's not an overstatement at all.
They call him, many people call him the John Reed of Latin America.
John Reed, but well, and I think I showed you this before we started. That is your Che Guevara portrait on my ink print T-shirt. So
very honored.
I'll wear this once and then send it on to you, and you can have your way with it. So have some fun with it. So,
thank you.
Tell me what's going on? What's going on with the pink tide?
Yeah, well, I think what's happening is, frankly, Latin America, the people are simply finally getting to direct the region in the way they've always wanted to. I mean, the U.S. has essentially, for the last over 100 years, been playing whack-a-mole, essentially, in Latin America, right? Every time a leftist or progressive government pops up, the U.S. has oftentimes managed to overthrow that government through various ways, through covert action, through military coups, what have you. And at some point, the U.S. just, that was going to just be impossible. It would have, the success, long-term success would have depended on the people of Latin America giving up, and they just haven't given up. And so the U.S. finds itself in a position where one country after another is moving to the left in some form or another. And again, what does that mean? I mean, you have these societies that have historically, first of all, been colonialized by Spain 500 years ago, which killed many indigenous people, forced many to convert to Catholicism, brought in slaves to various of these countries. And then just as, again, they thought, oh, hey, we've overthrown Spain and we're good to go. The U.S. then really took over for Spain as the colonial power, which was really what the Spanish-American War was about in 1898. We're told in school, of course, that was about the U.S., well, one, reacting to Spain because they allegedly sank the ship called the Maine, though I think there's good evidence it just exploded from within for one reason or another, and they used it as a pretext. But the other thing we're told is that we went and liberated these countries like Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines from Spain. And in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. We, in fact, simply we exchanged ourselves as the colonial power in lieu of Spain. And in the case of Cuba, for example, it was about 2/3 liberated by that point. I mean, it was ready to throw off Spanish colonialism by itself. And we came in and we just took over, and through the Platt Amendment, took over Cuba. And again, we could go down the line and how many other countries we did that to over the years. And so now we see finally the U.S.'s ability to keep these countries in tow, it's diminishing. And I think we have to thank the Latin American people for that. I mean, you just see this incredible resilience.
Mm-hmm. I don't know where to start.
We could start at Colombia. Colombia's a great place to start, I think.
Okay. All right. That's a good thing. And we are, tell me about this.
Yeah. So what happened? That's my friend, Gustavo Petro. I met him when he was a senator in Colombia. He's a very important historical figure there. He was a guerrilla in the M19 guerrillas, a leftist guerrilla group that waged an insurrectional war against the government for some time. And they then put down their arms, signed a peace accord. This allowed Petro to run for office. He became a senator. As during his time in Senate, he was most famous for exposing the parapolitical scandal, which is the scandal in which, showing that huge numbers of politicians in Colombia were ensconced with the paramilitaries. He also opposed the free trade agreement, which is something that he and I and the steelworkers actually worked together on trying to oppose, and were successful for some time. He then became mayor of Bogota, which is, the biggest city in Colombia. And
Colombia is big. Colombia is the third biggest Latin America country. I mean, there's a lot of people there.
It's over 50 million people.
Yeah, that's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. It has 100 indigenous groups. It has the third largest number of Afro descendants in the hemisphere at over 6 million. A lot of people don't realize that. Cali, Colombia, is the largest Spanish-speaking Afro-Colombian city in the hemisphere. So yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating place. It has, and of course, it's very rich in resources. It has a Pacific coast, Atlantic coast, has oil, gold, emeralds, fresh water, which has made it very, I think it's Eduardo Galeano, who talked about the resource curse, because they have these resources. The U.S. has coveted control over it and has managed to pretty much control it. Really since about 1903, with the, of course, Roosevelt's military conquest of Panama, breaking that off from Colombia, creating the canal. And the U.S. has had a lot of control since that time. One of the high watermarks in that country after the Panama the breaking away of Panama from Colombia was in 1948. A leftist president named Jorge Gaitan was running for president. He was very popular, looked like he was going to win, and he was assassinated. Many think by the CIA, though that is yet to be proven and not admitted to yet by the CIA. Eventually they tend to admit things. We don't know what the actual truth. We know the CIA had operatives there. We know that the U.S. was against Gaitan, but we don't know. But in any case, he was assassinated. And this led to La Violencia, in which 300,000 Colombians were killed in a civil war between the liberal and conservative party. Now, Gaitan's an interesting and important figure to talk about because Gustavo Petro is the first real leftist candidate to even seriously run for office since 1948, and have a chance of winning. Obviously, others ran, but little parties and whatnot. This was the first time you had a real leftist who could contest power and who actually won. I mean, that's an incredible feat.
He ran against TikTok Trump. The Hernandez, the fellow who said that how much he respected Adolf Hitler,
right,
as a philosopher, and then he said, "Oh, wait a second, that was a Freudian slip. It was actually Einstein I met. That wasn't, of course, it was Hitler." And
right.
he just seems like an absolute horrible person. I don't know how bad is he on a Trump scale? How bad is he?
Well, worse than Trump. I mean, in this country, of course, we talk about Trump as a fascist and other people's fascists. I'm not sure that's a fair category of those people. I think it is a fair category of the right wing in Colombia, which, has used death squads, these paramilitary groups, to carry out massacres, mass killings of the population, displacement of the population. Colombia has one of the highest internally displaced populations on earth. At the high water mark, they had about 8 million internally displaced people. That's out of 50 million, right? You're approaching really since the 1960s, with the U.S. backing the elite and the military and the paramilitary death squads. And then you had the main guerrilla group, the FARC, which signed a peace accord in 2016, which the government is largely honored in the breach. They have killed a lot of ex-combatants of the FARC, and they continue to kill social leaders. And this is what Petro's up against. First of all, it was a miracle he survived enough to win, because he was threatened with death. So was his vice presidential candidate, Francia Marquez, an Afro-Colombian, first Afro-Colombian vice president. They campaigned behind bulletproof shields.
Oh, my God.
Even the Washington Post ran a story on that fact. Now they're in office, but I mean, they're not out of the woods. They confront a military that is largely, certainly at the top, almost thoroughly against them, right? And, if you want to talk about another historical figure, Salvador Allende, who, was overthrown in a U.S.-backed military coup in 1973, you'd have to say that Allende was in a better position than Petro when he was had a couple loyal generals like Letelier, who was murdered, right, in 1976 in a car bomb in Washington, D.C. I don't think Petro has one loyal general. And he's hired an anti-corruption czar, a guy who's most famous for going after Escobar, to now run to be the defense minister. And he's going to try to weed these bad people out. But, you're talking about a lot of bad people in the military who are very deeply ensconced with the paramilitaries. I mean, the truth is, what they say is the paramilitaries are really military guys during the day and paramilitaries at night. But of course, as he tries to do that, as he may try to replace generals, put in generals that are loyal to him, you're going to see a backlash from the military, which is very powerful there, which the U.S. supports. you already have, there's a right-wing senator in Colombia. She last week called for a crusade against Petro by the military. And you have people like Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz supporting that type of call. So it's a very dangerous situation. I mean, it's very hopeful. People are very excited that Petro and Marquez are, in the leadership. They've moved very quickly to do some progressive things. I mean, the first thing they did is recognize Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, which had not had diplomatic relations with Colombia under this President Duque, the outgoing president. He immediately recognized him, immediately appointed ambassadors. He has reopened the border with Venezuela. And I saw just today, he told the Colombian airline company to be prepared to start flying again to Venezuela. I mean, it was insane. Like, you could not fly directly from Colombia to Venezuela. They're right next door. And Petro wants to fix that. I mean, these are huge things. The U.S. is not thrilled about that, to say the least. But Petro wants to unify his country, wants to bring a true peace to the country. And he wants to unify Latin America, just like Simon Bolivar. That was his dream, right? When he overthrew Spanish colonialism. By the way, he overthrew a battle exactly 203 years on the day before the inauguration, on August 7th this year of 2022. And, famously, so the inauguration was held in Plaza Bolivar, which is the big kind of official plaza. You could compare it to the mall in Washington, D.C. It's not as big, but it's similar with, the Supreme Court on one side and the presidential palace on the other. Actually, the cathedral, beautiful Catholic cathedral in the middle. And 20,000 people showed up. I mean, body to body, as many people as they could cram in there to the inauguration, which itself was unprecedented. People have not had much to celebrate in terms of recent inaugurations, and they have largely not showed up, but people came to this one. And famously, he called for the sword of Bolivar to be brought to him on the stage from the museum.
And the Bolivarian Revolution is the revolution of trying to consolidate and unify and have common interest with all of these Latin American countries. Is that
right?
Somewhat accurate?
The first Bolivarian Revolution was first to overthrow Spain, to kick Spain out.
Right.
And then the dream of Bolivar was to unite countries like Colombia, Venezuela, which of course is known as the Bolivarian Republic now, right? Chavez called it. Well, he didn't call it. I mean, under the Constitution that the people voted for, it's called the Bolivarian Republic because Bolivar is a very important symbol there. While Colombia has the sword of Bolivar, Venezuela has Bolivar's remains, which are kept in a church there. And other contiguous countries. So, but that never happened. That type of unity never came to fruition. But, people like Chavez, like Maduro, and now like Gustavo Petro would like to see that happen. They would like to see.
Dan, what's his domestic agenda?
His domestic agenda, first and foremost, is end the war, because the war is not ended. And that means getting rid of the paramilitaries. It also means convincing the one remaining leftist guerrilla group, the ELN, to lay down its arms. By the way, the day he was inaugurated, the ELN reached out to him to talk about doing just that. And some paramilitary groups did as well. So that's number one on his agenda. And the next is to alleviate poverty and to deal with the horrible inequality in that country. Colombia is one of the most unequal societies in the world. If you look at the, what's that?
The Gini
coefficient, right, is one of the highest there. And so he wants to tax the rich, and he wants to help these, the vast majority of poor people in that country. I mean, if you go to Bogota, or at least parts of Bogota, you go to Cartagena, the old city, which people do all the time. They go on vacations there. You think, oh, wow, this is a very modern country. And this, parts of Bogota seemed like they look like Chicago, but if you start, you go much beyond that, you start to see very poor places, very poor countryside, very poor cities. One in particular, Quibdó, I visited it. It's up near the Panamanian border. It is an Afro-Colombian city. It doesn't have paved roads. It doesn't have running water. It doesn't have sewage. It's been completely abandoned by the central government. Now, showing what he wants to do with the country, one of the first cities he visited after he was inaugurated was Quibdó. And he said, this government's abandoned you, and that ends now. We're going to take care of you. We're going to get you your, infrastructure that you deserve. And he wants to do that for the poor in that country. And that's an amazing agenda. I mean, you talk about an ambitious agenda. He has a whole 10-point plan he came up with. He wants to, increase women's participation in the economy and politics. In fact, he named his vice president, Francia Marquez, as the Minister of Gender. I forget what he called it, gender parity or gender equality. So he wants to make it a more equal society. He wants to give voice to the indigenous people, to Afro descendants. These are people which, in large part, have been ignored at best and persecuted at worst. They disproportionately represent the displaced peoples, disproportionately represent the poor, and they have been disproportionately killed during this war. Again, making Francia Marquez's election as vice president quite incredible. And again, he's made it clear he wants to give voice to those people, and he wants to make them a part of the greater Colombian society. The day before the inauguration, I had a chance to go to actually what was called the Indigenous Inauguration. So that was held the day before, also in Bogota, in a big park. Hundreds of indigenous and Afro-Colombian peoples drove on buses from all over the country to Bogota to essentially give their blessing to Petro and Marquez as the new leaders of the country. They had their own inauguration. Petro was anointed with oil by one of the indigenous tribes, and both Petro and Marquez showed up to this event. Can you imagine having a parallel indigenous inauguration of a U.S. president, and the U.S. president coming and accepting that and saying, I am your president. I accept your honor of being your president. I mean, it's profound. And
what do you think the chances are that the United States will allow this?
That this will have an effect to truly change the country? Well, didn't we increase sanctions right after he got elected? Or was that Venezuela?
Colombia, no. I mean, they've increased sanctions against Nicaragua, but not against Colombia.
Okay.
They're trying to be careful right now. Look, there's no basis the U.S. has, to openly oppose him right now. I mean, he just got elected. No one claims the election was rigged or stolen. I mean, the U.S. has to at least pretend that they support the guy as a democratically elected president. Right. I mean, the U.S. has bragged for decades that Colombia is the, shining light of democracy in Latin America, even, of course, as, human rights leaders are being killed and whatnot. So, they're now kind of painting themselves in a corner. This great democracy has elected someone they may not like, but again, openly, they can't move against him. But I think what they're going to do, as they've done in many other countries, as they did in Chile, as they've done in Venezuela, is they are going to move behind the scenes to support opposition groups and violent opposition groups, to stir up trouble in the country, to force Petro's hands into reacting to that. They did that in Iran too with Mossadegh. They will do some things economically. They'll try to what they're probably going to do. I mean, again, while they've ignored all the human rights abuses of the military for decades, what they're probably do is now, when the military does carry out a human rights abuse, they're going to blame that on Petro and use that against them.
Right. I have
yeah.
Changing the subject, but not. I'm not as up to speed on all of this as you two are, and I've been reading a lot. And actually, my son is dating a very young, wonderful young lady that came to from Colombia when she was 8. Her family lives in Brooklyn, and they're great Colombian family. But one of the things that I did is I went back and was looking at the press coverage on this, and on Democracy Now! Did a fairly good job covering the election with Colombia, with Amy Goodman. The other major media were just horrible. They were horrible. They spent more time talking about the opponent's use of TikTok to campaign rather than his policies, which are bad policies. They alluded to the fact that this is kind of an ex-terrorist that somehow slipped in. They didn't give any. There's just this ignorance of America's coverage of Central and Latin America. And is it me, or do you see that too? Do you see the disinformation from the New York Times? The other major news organizations don't do a good job covering this.
Well, yeah, I mean, they do. I would only disagree to say that they do a great job covering it from their,
perspective, yeah,
to meet their goal, and that is they are laying the groundwork to go after this guy. They want to vilify him, as they've done every other progressive Latin American leaders. They did to Chavez, to Maduro, to Daniel Ortega, to Fidel Castro. And they're going to go hard after him. And again, any misstep that he makes or that others make that they can pin on him, they're going to highlight those things. So yeah, of course I saw that, and it's disturbing, but it's not surprising. That's their job. I mean, they're doing their job, and it's our job to get out other information. I mean, Petro's going to need a lot of solidarity. He's in a very precarious bind. He's incredibly courageous that he would run for president at all, and that he would, try to quickly go ahead and carry out progressive policies, and again, quickly start to be friends with Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba. I mean, that is the third rail for a Latin American leader. So
you told that story in your Venezuela book about I don't know if I can remember it well. The sending in the aid in the with the tankers or the container ships, sending in public aid, and how the containers were burned. And they blame Maduro, and I think the Gray Zone did some good reporting on it, and finally definitively said, "Well, wait a second, these weren't burned by Maduro; they were burned by the opposition," and they corrected that. So after multiple stories about how horrible this new socialist leader was in Venezuela, so bad that he would literally burn public aid coming in rather than having it come into the country, they finally corrected themselves with one little story in the New York Times, and that was it.
If you blinked, you didn't see it. And I don't remember that NPR ever corrected it. They covered the story. No, of course, this is how it goes, right? And CNN was there, by the way. CNN saw exactly what happened. It was clear that they were torched. I forget how it all happened, but whatever was done to those trucks was done on the Colombian side of the border. It wasn't even done in Venezuela. It was clearly done from the Colombian side, clearly done to try to, make Maduro look bad. And again, as the Gray Zone pointed out, CNN had a vantage point to see that was true, and yet quickly reported that it was the Maduro people who did it. I mean, they just completely lied. And the only reason the press corrected itself is because there were videos that definitively showed what happened. If you didn't have those videos, they would have never corrected it. Yeah, this was a very extreme example. I'll give you another extreme example. And I mean, there's many, but in Colombia, there's an indigenous group. The biggest indigenous group is the Wayu people in La Guajira, which is an area which actually crosses from Colombia into Venezuela. And the Wayu are actually allowed to cross from Colombia into Venezuela and back and forth because that's considered their territory. Well, in the Colombian side, the people there are dying. I mean, thousands of kids have died from malnutrition over recent years, and many more will die. No one disputes this. I visited the Wayu people in that area a few years ago, and it's incredible. I mean, and you see very quickly why they're dying, because their arid land is getting no water from the river that they have depended on for centuries to survive from. I mean, so they took me to the river, which is, I don't know, 20 yards wide or so. There's no water in it. It's completely bone dry. Okay. So they can't get water to irrigate their crops. They can't get water to drink. It's a desperate situation. Now, that's the background to this. So John Otis, who I follow pretty close on NPR because he's their Latin American correspondent, and he is the king of disinformation. He has this kind of aw shucks type of delivery, but he's really, really bad. So he covered this story. He said, oh yeah, I want to tell you about these Wayu people, and they're dying and they're starving, and this is terrible. And he said, there's really two reasons for this, okay? He said, one, because of the culture of the Wayu. They have this backwards culture and aren't taking care of their kids and blah, blah, blah. And also, he said, number two, because Venezuela had stopped allowing subsidized food from Venezuela to be brought over to Colombia, to be stolen and brought over to Colombia. So it's the Venezuelans' fault, and it's the Wayu people's own fault. What he didn't say is the following fact that everyone knows about. That the reason they're dying is because that river is dry, and that river is dry because a major multinational mining company has dammed it and is using all the water for their mining operations. He did not even mention that fact, right? So it's not the mining company's problem. It's not the Colombian government's blame for failing to get them to, even in spite of the dammed river, getting them food and water. No, it's the Venezuelans' fault, and it's the fault of the Wayu people themselves. I mean, this is incredible propaganda, right? But if you're a casual listener to something like NPR, you'd have no idea that he just laid a bunch of bull on you, right?
Greg, what do you think about this? How pessimistic are you that our ability to get out reasonable, accurate information never is going to be effective? And I don't know.
That's easy, zero. But my question for Dan is, there were U.S. advisors in Colombia for a long time, stationed in are there still U.S. troops in Colombia?
Absolutely. And that's, again, going to be another thing. Now, Petro has said nothing about that, as far as I know. He's been very careful. I'm sure he wants those troops gone. I'm sure he wants the advisors gone. I'm sure he wants to get Colombia out of its NATO partnership, right? Colombia is the only partner of NATO south of the border. They even carried out NATO military operations, naval operations in the Pacific side, right? NATO is, of course, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but they were carrying out operations in the Pacific earlier this year. But I don't think that's going to be his first order of business. I think that is a red line. I mean, I think that's where he gets cooed, right? So I think, we'll see how he deals with that. I think, frankly, it's the smart move to maybe live with it for now, because the U.S. has depended on Colombia as a major base of operations. They operate out of 7 different military bases there. They have this NATO partnership with Colombia. So I don't see Petro moving against that quickly, because I do think the U.S. move very quickly to dislodge him, if not kill him. So we will see. We will see how that all develops. I mean, it will be a hat trick for him to deal with that.
There's been a strong negative turn in the pink tide years ago, with Argentina shifting electorally, and of course Lula being jailed in Brazil, and of course, and so on. So, but now it seems to be swinging again back the other way. Lula's out of jail. He's leading in the polls in Brazil. Argentina has a new government, or had a new government a year or so ago, moving in that direction. Chile now has a quote unquote leftist government. How do you see this going? I mean, what's your overall assessment? How do you see developments in Latin America moving forward? There have been setbacks, but there have been returns. In Peru, you have a new administration.
Right. He claims to be a socialist. AMLO in Mexico has been.
It's brand new.
So what's your overall picture you're drawing from this? What conclusions are you drawing from this?
I think Latin America and the Caribbean are going to continue moving left. That doesn't mean there won't be setbacks. There will be, of course, for various reasons. But I think the overall trend and trajectory is going to be towards the left. I think the U.S. cannot stop this from happening. And I do think if Lula becomes president of Brazil later this year, I think that will help solidify the left tide. And why has this happened? I mean, again, I think largely because, again, the U.S., they were, instrumental in the so-called car wash campaign in Brazil, which led to Lula's arrest and being jailed. He sat in jail during the election that Bolsonaro was elected in. The U.S. has used different machinations to get rid of some of these left-wing leaders. They were behind the coup in Honduras in 2009. Now, of course, the president who was couped in 2009, Manuel Zelaya, his wife is now president. So the U.S. just cannot keep these people down, is what it comes to. I think they see daylight. I think they see the chance to start doing what they want, to start getting out of the grip of the United States. And the truth is, one thing that is allowing them to do that is the rise of China. Even Argentina is now turning towards Russia and China and away from the IMF. Nicaragua is turning hard towards China. They now have a choice. They have other people they can trade with if they're sanctioned. Venezuela, of course, works very closely with China, and Iran. Iran's another country that has a lot of, what's the word? That has a lot of influence, I guess, in the region. Not so much influence, but they're turned to quite a bit for help. I think Iran has been more critical in helping Venezuela survive the sanctions than any other country. They've helped get their oil industry back online. They've actually delivered fuel to Venezuela. It's quite impressive what Iran's done. This deserves a whole nother topic, but Iran to me is a very interesting and peculiar country because it is not run by leftists. It's run by, Islamicists, by the mullahs, they're called, by, their supreme leader is a religious leader. It is a theocracy, though it does have a civilian elected government, and it's a bit complex how those two interact with each other. But nonetheless, they've shown a lot of solidarity with countries like Venezuela and increasingly with Nicaragua now. And this is why, again, the U.S. is really upset about the rise of countries like China and Iran and Russia getting back on its feet after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because not only because, they're rivals of the U.S., but because they can offer some help to these countries. And I think you're going to see more and more countries, reaching out to them, which, of course, is that violates the main tenet of the Monroe Doctrine, which is that no country outside the hemisphere is to have any influence in the region outside the United States, right? And that the Monroe Doctrine is still very much in force. Under the Monroe Doctrine, Latin America is considered the U.S. backyard. Biden was nice enough to say, well, it's our front yard. Oh, I guess that's nice. Maybe they water it a little more or something. But it's still the yard, right? We got the house and they got the yard. So, but I think that's ending. I don't think the U.S. can maintain it. Again,
the two countries that the West never forgives. The first country that the West never forgave and will not forgive,
Cuba,
and is totally Haiti.
Haiti.
Since the revolution, since Toussaint Louverture, the world has never forgiven them for defying the West. And the disaster to Haiti is today is the exemplar of that. And the other, of course, Pat's right, is Cuba. And
right.
They just will not forgive Cuba. And the situation
and Nicaragua, Cuba, they're not going to forgive Nicaragua.
Yeah, but Cuba is in the gun sights always. And that's a country because it defied the United States in such a strong way, successfully. And it chose such a different path. All the pink tide, which is very exciting, none of them have chosen the direction, the economic direction that Cuba took, and they'll never be forgiven for that. So we must put our solidarity there. What they're going through today, since this devastation in was it in Matanzas, Dan, with the oil refineries, oil tanks, is really just another blow. I mean, nature's blow to an already ugly situation that the United States has created. I mean, it's solely created by the United States. And under Biden, it's worse. Maybe Biden is going to loosen up a little in terms of the rest of Latin America, but not Cuba.
Not Cuba, Nicaragua. I mean, they keep piling on sanctions on Nicaragua. Maybe Venezuela will loosen up in order to get some oil from them.
Yeah, it's the oil issue there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, Venezuela may be able to bargain something there, which shows some power, right? The fact that Biden had to go hat in hand to Venezuela, begging for oil, shows this is a different world we're in now.
Different moment, yes.
Take everything they want, like in the past. And that's great. That is how it should be, right? Yeah. So we're seeing the development of that.
In preparation for this, again, I'm admitting my ignorance in this region of the area, but I read the Wikipedia page on Operation Condor.
Mm-hmm.
This is I was in college when this is going on. A horrible campaign of CIA state terror, where we went in and meddled with these governments. And it's now pretty fairly transparent about how horrible we were in our operation in dealing with them. A number of civilian casualties, mining harbors. Tell me about Operation Condor and how we set the stage between late 60s, 70s for how many decades? It ended what, in the 80s? 90s?
Chile, it really just ended in some way. They just got rid of the Pinochet constitution like a year ago. I mean, they haven't even agreed to a new one yet. I mean, really, obviously the horrible repression ended some time ago, but the impact of it is still being felt, of course, because what Operation Condor was really the ushering in of the neoliberal economic period.
Right. Chicago boys. Yeah.
The Chicago boys. In the first place it was installed was in Chile in 1973. So this is the new economic order that the U.S. wanted to impose, and they imposed it through brutal fascist. These are real fascist governments, right? Like in Chile, where they overthrew a democratically elected president in Salvador Allende. They installed this General Pinochet, who, he go look up pictures of him with his big black cape and all. Killed 3,000 Chileans, tortured probably 30,000, and then helped overthrow these governments next to him. So then you had, of course, Argentina, which again had a fascist coup in which a fascist, really neo-Nazi junta took over, forcibly disappeared 30,000 people, which included the other thing they did, and then they did it with the Catholic Church there. They would, if a leftist woman was captured and she was pregnant, they would force her to give birth and they'd steal the child from her, right? This was, in fact, there's an Oscar award-winning film which details the theft of these children. The whole generation of kids grew up, they didn't even know who their parents were.
The original family separation policy.
Yeah, no, this is an incredible thing that happened in these countries, in Uruguay, Paraguay, all in the name of, again, bringing in this neoliberal order in which, everything's privatized, in which austerity measures are put in place, the working class is really put down, unions are destroyed. Again, this was fascism. This is what the U.S. used. And we can't forget that. People use this word fascism all the time, and we have to understand what it really is. I saw an interesting meme the other day, which I think is accurate. The Soviet Union overthrew Nazi Germany, and basically the U.S. absorbed what was left of it and used it, particularly in countries like Argentina, where, people make jokes about the fact that, all these Germans went and moved there, all these Nazis. And they, their philosophy became dominant in these countries in the 70s and 80s. And yeah, that is what the face of American capital is, when it gets desperate and has to turn to those measures. And in any case, as you know, the neoliberal order was brought, became the order of the day, and really gained traction throughout the rest of the world once the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And of course, Bill Clinton really became the face of neoliberalism in the U.S., Tony Blair in Great Britain. And as you all mentioned, we may be seeing finally the neoliberal order, which again was ushered in beginning in 1973, really becoming the dominant system in the 90s, and then, being the dominant system till now. It may be fraying. The neoliberal order may be coming to an end. I'm not, I'm not certain. I mean, we can't underestimate the resilience of American style capitalism, whatnot, but I think that it's being challenged in a very, very big way.
And in relationship to that, Greg and I read this book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order by Gary Gerstle. And Greg wrote an absolute wonderful review of this on his blog in Marxist-Leninist Today.
Yeah, I read it. It's great. It's excellent.
Oh, you read it too? Yeah. I don't know. What do you think about that, Greg? Do you think that this multi-decade trend is going away not only in the United States but also in Central America? What do you think, Greg?
Yeah, I think it is. The question here is what's going to replace it. I mean, the only candidate that jumped up, of course, was Trumpism. Trumpism rose as an alternative to globalism and the neoliberal order, et cetera, the whole story. And of course, many people went for it because of that. But that can't be the option. I mean, that just can't be the legitimate option for this country. That would be a disaster. But nothing's emerging from the Democratic Party, certainly, to replace the neoliberal order. No one has the courage to even speak to it. So I'm somewhat pessimistic in this country. And of course, the folks in the South, they seem to be much more willing to think new ideas and challenge old ideas than people in this country are. They're waiting for knights on white horses to come and rescue them from Trumpism. But the other option is to go back to the neoliberal order. So I'm somewhat pessimistic.
Well, and one thing, again, there's a huge discussion to be had on this, but the other thing is the people in Latin America have not fallen at least yet, knock on wood, for these cultural wars. That is not on there. People are fighting over food, trying to get fed, trying to get jobs, trying to survive. They don't have time for this nonsense, worrying about people's pronouns and whatnot. In the United States and other Western countries, that is what people care about. That is what the left seems to care about. They're not fighting for the poor. They're not fighting to end wars. And Latin America didn't fall for that. That has not bled into Latin America, not yet. And I don't really expect it to in a big way, in part because they have a very different culture than the U.S. Of course, some people would argue, a lot of liberals would claim that maybe they have a backwards culture. I think it's quite the opposite. But I think the U.S. is bogged down in this cultural war, not fighting over economic issues, not fighting over issues of war and peace. And I don't see that changing real soon. Obviously, people like us are trying to change that, but it's very difficult. Yeah. Certainly, the liberal intellectual class has no interest in that at all. The idea of Marxism and of class struggle, and if even looking at, historical materialism, I mean, just beginning with the idea that we actually look at reality to begin with, instead of complete lunacy, we've moved way away from that, because of postmodernism or whatever. And that intellectual current has destroyed the left in large part.
Well, we were talking before you came on about that exact same theme. You have DeSantis it's all cultural wars. Your
right.
Your trans person's reading your kindergartner's books, and he's going to be, doing hormone therapy in a year or two. And it unless the left can more articulately express the class issue and bury this cultural issue, I think we're not going to win the argument at all. We're not going to win the narrative at all. And there's so many things that we had a wonderful psychiatrist on a couple weeks ago, Joanna Moncrief, who was looking at psychiatry from kind of a Marxist perspective. And she was frustrated that people are constantly being medicated as opposed for depression or anxiety or angst, rather than looking at the whole social issues that are creating the malaise in people's lives. She wrote a very good article on a Marxist perspective from this. So much common sense, but it's just not part of our narrative. It's not part of CNN, MSNBC, certainly not part of Fox. Fox is all culture all the time, so.
Right.
I don't know.
Well, a lot of it is, again, the culture of the U.S., which has this incredibly, and it comes, of course, from the extreme form of capitalism we have. We have this extreme individualism. And so all problems are seen as individual problems that individuals can rise above. If you're not rising above it, you're a loser. And again, it's that individualism which also has really influenced how leftism, if you want to call it that, is manifesting itself. Again, it's all about individual identity and not about collective struggle, and certainly not about class struggle.
Yeah, that's exactly what she said. If you just have a brain chemistry problem, then it's kind of your problem. If you have society falling apart and economies falling apart and housing, then we have to maybe look at it differently than it being your problem. So I don't know.
Exactly. And again, I think in Latin America, they have a more collectivist idea of society. And some of that grew out of the indigenous groups, which frankly, the Spanish were not quite as good quite as thorough in their genocide against the indigenous peoples there as the U.S. is as the folks were, the Europeans were in North America. And so those indigenous values also have, had a greater influence in Latin America over the years.
I again, back to Venezuela, when Maduro got in, 60% increase in social spending, 44% decrease in poverty, 25% decrease in infant mortality, free college, free university, building up the hospital. And what do we do? We sanction the crap out of them, it's just, we want to, you need to fail so we can bring our neoliberal corporate folks in and get better control of your resources. I mean, what's the problem?
We want to make them happy, Pat. We want to make them happy. We want to make them happy consumers.
Yeah, but why are we so ignorant about this? Well, you're not. You're doing God's work on all this stuff, but I don't know. It's frustrating.
You have a very thoroughly ideologized society. I mean, and it's a very, the disinformation machine is very, it's very elegant, and it's very nuanced, and it works. People talk about 1984 all the time, which talked about, really more brute force being used against people. That's in the U.S. That's not it. It's more Brave New World. I mean, it's more done, frankly, through drugs, right? Everyone's taken some form of drug medication, and through a media that is very, very good at very subtly pushing narratives that don't look like censorship, that don't look like propaganda, right? People can see through naked propaganda. And you have Hollywood, of course, which has been the cultural center of the earth for a long, long time. And that's still true in the U.S., obviously, which is very powerful, though that's becoming less and less true in the world. China's right now has its own cinema. India, you're seeing Iran has a very great cinema now. Again, you're now seeing even the U.S.'s cultural hegemony being challenged, but not within the United States. I mean, Hollywood still really defines, what the predominant culture is. And again, it's very elaborate and very effective. And to fight against it is very difficult. I mean, one great example is that movie Top Gun. That's a sequel to Top Gun that came out this year. It's now one of the most profitable films ever. And it was nothing but a military recruitment film. I mean, literally the military went to the theaters and was there recruiting people. They had tables at the showings. I mean, that's what it was. And it's quite incredible, but people don't see that as such. They see it as entertainment. They're entertaining themselves through Army recruitment videos.
Yeah. And DeSantis is now using that. So using that. Hey, this has just been so good. You're really doing such good work. I've learned so much from you, and I recommend people pick up your books. I'm looking forward to the Nicaragua book. I read the reviews of it so far, and that'll be just exciting. Before you go, tell the story about you meeting Chomsky in MIT. And I asked you, I think off the camera last time, have you ever met Chomsky? And you said, yeah, I met him in his office. Tell me the story about that.
Well, I was friends with Avi Chomsky at the time, one of his daughters, because we were working on Colombia, South America related issues, and we found each other doing that work. And I went to visit her, and at some point, and I'm very careful with people who have famous parents. You don't want to reduce them to their parents. So I said, hey, Avi, if there's any chance, I could go meet you. That'd be kind of cool. She said, sure, we'll do it. So she brought me over to see Noam Chomsky, and it was great. I mean, look, he's an interesting guy. The guy lives like a monk. He sat there. He said, do you mind if I eat my lunch? And pulled out a untoasted bagel with American cheese that he ate in front of me. But the interesting thing is that on his wall, he had one poster on his wall, and he said, he said, this is like a Rorschach test for people. Everyone who comes in or say who's on that poster. He says, I know a lot about you. If you know who they are, you don't. And it was Oscar Romero and the 6 Jesuits who were killed in El Salvador. And it's very interesting, and he talks a lot about those people, talks a lot about liberation theology. And of course, this is, a Jewish man who grew up on a kibbutz. And he's very fascinated with the Liberation Church and the persecution of it. And I found that very interesting. That was the one poster on his pretty austere walls. But he's a very nice man, and his kids love him, which says the world to me, too.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't agree with Chomsky on everything, and I have some disagreements with him on a lot of things, but I think he is a decent human being, and I think he's got a lot of important things to say. So there you go.
Greg and I are pissed off at him because we were trying to get him on a podcast, and he didn't respond. So I'll keep at that. So,
and he's getting old. He's getting old now.
I know he is. He is. So
do it. That'd be great.
Any final thoughts, Greg?
No, I think we covered a lot of territory. It's always a pleasure to be with Dan.
Always a pleasure to be with you. I'm glad we did it. I appreciate you having me on, really.
Write a book about Cuba.
Okay. I'll put that on my list.
Good.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Cheers. Be well.